Okay, well, good morning and welcome to Haverhill Cemetery, which we felt was an appropriate venue for today's walk and talk event. We are here to remember those men from Haverhill who found themselves in the Far East in 1942. The majority of men from Haverhill and the surrounding villages who enlisted joined the battalions from the Suffolk and Cambridgeshire regiments. The 4th and 5th Battalion Suffolk Regiment, along with the 1st and 2nd Cambridgeshires, formed part of the 18th Division. With them were the 4th, 5th, 6th Battalions, Royal Norfolk Regiment, the 4th Battalion Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire, and the 1st and 5th Battalions of the Sherwood Foresters. Today we will try and tell you the story of what happened when the 18th Division was mobilised and give you a taste what the men experienced in the Far East. We will be moving round the cemetery to visit some of the graves, all of which can be reached by the path. You may stand on the grass, but please take care if you do so. I think it's worth setting the scene so we understand what was happening in the Far East at the time. When Japan entered the war on the side of the Axis powers in December 1941, their main aims were to acquire raw materials, particularly oil, rubber and tin, but also to provide space for the population of their overcrowded home islands. They worked on the assumption that a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii would enable the Imperial Japanese Army, Air Force and Navy to attain their territorial aims before the Western Allies could react. The raid at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 was a devastating blow to the Americans. However, it failed in its main aim, which was to sink the fleet of the American aircraft carriers, because they were out at sea on that day. Despite this, Japanese plans elsewhere worked beyond expectations. Hong Kong and Indochina fell to them without difficulty, but the greatest triumphs occurred on the Malay Peninsula and in Singapore. There were two reasons for the Japanese invasion of Burma in 1942. Firstly, it would enable them to cut overland access to China from Burma, thus permitting the Japanese to conquer all China. And furthermore, control in Burma would place the Japanese at the gateway to India. The Burma campaign became the longest continuous campaign fought by the British, who were supported by the Commonwealth, American and Chinese troops. Yet their struggles were little known at the time, and when Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Far East commander, addressed these men in Burma in 1943, he said, "I understand you believe you're the forgotten army. That's not true. The truth is, no one's ever bloody well heard of you." But we are getting ahead of ourselves, so back to 1939 and the mobilisation of the 18th Division. Our journey today begins in 1939, when many local men joined the territorial battalions of the Suffolk, Cambridgeshire and Norfolk regiments. After completing initial training, they were responsible for the defence of the east coast from Lowestoft to the Wash. And during 1941, they were trained in desert warfare for the expected service in the Middle East, and in October, the battalions of the 18th Division were mobilised. They boarded the ships that comprised the 18th Division convoy and sailed from ports including Liverpool and Glasgow, bound for Suez. To avoid enemy submarines, they journeyed across the Atlantic to Nova Scotia in Canada, and there they transferred to large luxury liners that had been requisitioned. They then travelled via Trinidad to Cape Town, where they had some shore leave. On the 7th of December, news arrived of a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and speculation grew as to where their final destination might be. This one act changed the course of their future, for instead of going to the Middle East, they now found themselves bound for the Far East. The convoy split, with part going to India, where the men undertook further training, while the other moved to Mombasa, where they spent Christmas.
5 years ago we had the privilege of interviewing Ernie Brett, He's 101 now, but he was 97 at the time. And he was telling us about the journey from Gourock, which was where he sailed from, and the time that he left Cape Town. He was in part of the convoy that sailed as far as Mombasa, while the others went to India to do some more training. And he said, leaving Cape Town and going to Mombasa, the talk was all about Christmas Day. And it was looking forward to that. I have to say, first of all, that they were sailing on a requisitioned luxury liner, an American liner that had been requisitioned. So it wasn't your normal troop ship. And they were really looking forward to Christmas dinner, and they'd been promised turkey. And on Christmas Eve, when they got up, there were turkeys hanging everywhere, but not for eating. The refrigeration had broken down, and they had to just dump all the turkeys. And so what did they have for Christmas dinner? They had corned beef. That was probably the lightest part of that journey, you know. It was a little bit of humour. But from there they went to Singapore, and they arrived in Singapore at the beginning of January. And I thought it was worth just looking at a map so that we know and remind ourselves a little bit about Singapore. So I put a map up. It's not terribly large, so I hope you can see it. But this map here shows you the Malay Peninsula here with Malaysia is actually marked. It's two separate pieces of land essentially. The yellow part marks Malaysia. And you can see that as you come up from the Malay Peninsula, you come into Thailand and Burma. You can see here Indonesia and Java, and over here would be the Philippines. Up here is the Philippines, just on the map. Hong Kong's about here. But that gives you some sort of idea. And you can't see Singapore on here, it's not marked. But in reality, Singapore is right down at the tip of this Malay Peninsula. And I do have another map that will show you. What's this? This will show you Singapore. And bear in mind, it's right down at the very bottom of that. Stay on. Right down at the bottom of that Malay Peninsula, and it's a sort of diamond-shaped island. It sort of reminds me of the Isle of Wight, actually. So anybody who's familiar with the south coast and Gosport and Portsmouth will know the stretch of the Solent and the Isle of Wight. And it's a very similar shape. The size of Singapore is about the same size as West Suffolk, so it's really not very big. And it's about twice the size of the Isle of Wight. So all these battalions were fighting here. This is where they landed, down here, and then they went into the different parts of Singapore as soon as they arrived. So let's see. They arrived. Some of the ships arrived on the 13th of January, and the rest on the 29th. And I think the ones that arrived on the 29th were probably a little bit surprised and probably very dismayed to see that ships were leaving Singapore, taking the remnants of the RAF with them. And the RAF went down to Java. Take that one off. Went down here. So they left Singapore here and they sailed down to Java, because they were very anxious about the Japanese who were coming down this sort of headway, and they were already into the Malay Peninsula, this yellow bit here. Okay, so all these troops arrived, and there was no defence, absolutely no defence. So they were quite worried. And as they disembarked, they were attacked by Japanese planes. And it must have been quite frightening for them, mustn't it? So they were sent to different positions. Some of the battalions headed straight up from Singapore into the country called Johore, which is right at the very bottom. I don't think I've got that. Is that on that map? Let me just put it here. There we go. So some of the battalions that arrived left Singapore and went straight up into Johore, which is here. And one of the regiments that went up there was the 2nd Battalion Cambridges. And can I just introduce you to Rita? Rita's brother Eric, along with Ernie Faith, were 2 of the 2nd Cambridges that ended up going up country, as they described it, to try and hold the defences at Batuka Hat. I wonder now if you'd like to look in your booklet at page 6. I think it's... On page 6 there's a map, and this map shows an area around here, right in the centre of Singapore, and it shows an area called Adam Park. And Adam Park was a very sort of posh estate, huge houses on a hill, and it was the area where the 1st Battalion Cambridges had to defend. So that was where they were, and they held off a series of attacks by the Japanese and fought for 3 days without water and with minimal rations. They were under constant air attack and artillery barrage, but they managed to inflict hundreds of casualties, and they destroyed numerous enemy tanks with the loss of only 50 men, where the Japanese, I think, lost about 500. Other battalions, though, were less fortunate, and if you can look at this map, you can see Adam Park on the left-hand side. Slightly to the north, you can see a golf course somewhere. I think this isn't the best map to show the golf course, but just north of Adam Park there's a golf course. It's quite close to the Lawney Road and the McRitchie Reservoir, and that's where the 4th Suffolks were based, and they were actually nearly decimated there because they fought in the they fought in the cemetery, and it was dark and it was night time, and we'll see some pictures later on that give you an idea of what it must have been like for the 4th Suffolks. The 5th Suffolks, was your father a 5th Suffolk? Yeah, I think.
He read it out.
Yeah,
I think so.
I think he was a 5th Suffolk. Well, he was down a little bit lower. On this map, can you see Bukit Timah Road? It comes in from the left, just south of Adam Park. Adam Park's written in red,
Oh, yes,
and just below there, that road, it came down from a hill. Bukit means hill in whatever language they speak there, Malay language. Bukit means hill, and so they were defending that particular road. So you can see that the 1st Cambridges, the 4th and 5th Suffolks were in quite a close proximity, and all just south of this reservoir here, which was called the McRitchie Reservoir. So I've made a triangle, if you like. The 2nd Cambridges were up on the Bradwell Road. You can see that up at the top. It goes, there's the, I can show you here, that's the Bradwell Road. So with the 2nd Cambridges there, the 4th Suffolks here, the 5th Suffolks there, and the 1st Cambridges there in the middle. Anyway. The first casualties in this whole campaign for the Battle of Singapore died before they even had a chance to become Far East prisoners of war. They were killed in the fighting in the lead up to the surrender. And I don't think we've got anybody here who was a fifth. Oh, you think your father was a 5th Suffolk. So of the 69 men from Haverhill and the surrounding villages, 39 of those were 5th Suffolks. You know, that's well over half were 5th Suffolks. And when they arrived on the 29th of January, they were involved in fierce fighting defending the northeast of the island near an airstrip. So they were sent, when they arrived here, they were sent over here to this, there's a sort of peninsula, and just close by is an airstrip, and they were sent there to defend that. But the Japanese were on the Malay Peninsula, and the distance there is about a mile. In some places it's less than half a mile, but in this particular place they had all their artillery and it was about a mile away, so you can imagine that the barrage that they got from that must have been pretty terrible. Anyway, the 5th Suffolks were defending this northeast stretch. It was about 70 miles, I think, that they had to look after. And there were some open beaches and long stretches of mangrove swamps. And on the 6th of February, that was a week after arriving in Singapore, a 21-year-old from Steeple Bumpstead called Reginald Wesley was killed. He was killed while holding down a position right over here on Pongol Point. He and another member of the 5th Battalion, Suffolks, were killed by mortar shrapnel. Just a week later, on the 13th of February, just, you know, not even 2 weeks after arriving, Edward Charles Bradford, also of the 5th Suffolks, he was 30, and he was one of 7 from the battalion who were killed. And he was killed in Bukit Timah Road. So they'd obviously moved down from here back to the centre to Bukit Timah Road in those few days. And he was buried in a cemetery that was in Adam Park. And he was buried by 2 members of the Australian Infantry Force, a padre and a lieutenant. Later on, in 1947, he was moved to Cranji Cemetery. So there were lots of men who were buried in Adam Park who were eventually moved on. The sad thing, I mean, it's sad when you hear of anybody having to suffer and least of all give their life, but Edward's son, Kenneth, was born at about the same time as his father was killed. So when he left in October the previous year, he would have been looking forward to, you know, his wife having his first child, and so sad. Anyway, we move on. The 4th Suffolks, we have a casualty there before the fall of Singapore, and that was a Private Henry Minot from Castle Camps. He died on the 14th of February, and the 4th Suffolks were virtually decimated as they defended Bukit Brown Cemetery and the golf course. 7 men from Haverhill and the surrounding villages served with this battalion, and Bob's uncle Les, yes, got it right now. Bob's uncle Les was one of those 7 men from Haverhill who was serving with the 4th. And if you look at page 2, actually you had your uncle Les, his brother-in-law, was also serving with them, wasn't he? Eric Nunn.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, he was with the 1st Suffolks.
Yeah.
So one of them was with the 4th Suffolks, and the other was with the 1st Cambridgeshires, Eric Nunn. Right, if you look at page 2 of your little booklet, on page 2 you can see an aerial photograph, and it's not in the same, it doesn't give you the same perspective as that map, because you can see Adam Park at the top, and if you turned your book through 90 degrees, that would match the map. But here you can see that Adam Park is there. You've got the golf course, Hill 95, somewhere called Hellfire Corner, and down at the bottom left-hand corner, the Chinese cemetery, which was where the 4th Suffolks really struggled. We won't look at page 3 just yet. We'll look at page 4, and here are a couple of images of Bukit Brown Cemetery, where the 4th Suffolks had a dreadful time. The Japanese came in on tanks, and although it wasn't very easy for them to navigate the cemetery with all the tombstones, you can imagine how frightening it must have been there. This was a nighttime battle, and bad enough being in a cemetery in the dark, but when you're having to fight for your lives, it must have been just dreadful. Okay, so I think that's all. Page 6. Are we back to page 6? Yeah, page 6 is the area that's shown on that that photograph, or the aerial photograph. So you can look at that later and try and put it into context. Okay. So.
Okay, near the chapel down there, just on the corner, is the grave of Samuel Austin and Ruth Bigmore. Bigmore is a well-established Haverhill family name with generations of clerks and accountants going back to the 1700s. John is remembered here on a tablet on his parents' grave. In 1910, Samuel and Ruth had the second of their 6 children, a son they named John after his paternal grandfather. John attended a local school, and when he left, an aunt paid for him to a private tuition in typing and shorthand. With these skills, he found employment in a local solicitor's office in Station Road as a trainee solicitor's clerk. After completing his training, he left Haverhill, moving to London, where he found employment with Harrods. Initially being responsible for taking minutes at company meetings, he continued to study at night school and qualified as a chartered accountant. In 1935, still employed by Harrods, he married Ellen Bell, known as Queenie, in Kensington. And with the outbreak of war, he volunteered to join the Territorial Army. In March 1942, he was promoted to 2nd Lieutenant with the 1st Battalion, the Cambridgeshire Regiment. On page 3, if you go back to page 3, you should see a photograph of John. Lieutenant John Bigmore is seen here with some men from the 1st Cambridgeshires. He is seated 3rd from the left. And sitting beside him, 2nd from the left, is Captain Bill Gertines of Chauncey Mill in Haverhill. John's battalion found themselves defending positions in Adams Park, an estate of luxurious houses. John was the adjutant attached to the battalion headquarters, but in the days up to the surrender, he took command of A Company because of heavy losses. And on the 15th of February, just hours before the order to lay down arms, John was in the grounds of Adams Park when he was fatally wounded by a sniper. Reginald Wesley, Edward Charles Bradford, Henry Minot and John Bigmore were later reburied in Kranji Cemetery, Singapore.
If you look at these pictures of the houses, you can see just how grand they were. And the photograph that I included there is number 7, which was where John Bigmore was killed. They were defending the ground. They obviously had large gardens, and but they're all like that, all pretty typical. And if you're particularly interested in that, and you look online, I think it's called the Adam Park Project. There's a whole website dedicated to Adam Park, and they had a group of archaeologists out there, excuse me, and they were doing some digs, and they found all sorts of items that had been obviously left behind by the battalions that were fighting there. Not just the Cambridgeshires, but the others, because they were so close to there, and they had a field ambulance centre there, so lots of the wounded men were taken to Adam Park.
I think they buried a load of stuff. I know my uncle, they must have ended up at Tang Glen Road, which is the bottom of your map.
Yeah.
And he'd buried his stuff all in Tang Glen Road.
Did he?
Because when I was stationed out there, he asked me to see if I could find it.
Did you?
No, it's all built up and that.
So,
Yeah. But I imagine they were pushed back from Buckatima Road
yes.
down to Tang Glen.
Yeah.
Called his house Tangling, didn't it? This was weird, really.
But, yeah.
Okay,
Anyway.
we're going to take a short walk now, just up this path to the grave of Ernest John Barrett. So if you'd like to follow me. Okay, well this is the grave of Ernest Edward Barrett and his wife Marie Helen. You will notice there is also an inscription remembering their son Ernest John Barrett. If you turn to page 10 of your booklet, we'll find two photographs of Ernest. There is one of him as a toddler with his parents and sister, and the other one is a photograph of him as an adult, probably taken shortly before the outbreak of war. His father was a regular soldier who at the outbreak of World War I was amongst the first to be sent to France, seeing action in the First Battle of Ypres. While serving in France, Ernest married Marie Helen Gambier, the daughter of a brewery worker. Ernest and Marie set up their home at 1 Waveney Terrace, Haverhill, where Ernest John was born on the 8th of July 1919. Two further children, Janet Marie and Herbert George, completed the family. Ernest John worked for the Haverhill Cooperative Society before joining C Company, 4th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment. Before leaving for overseas, embarkation leave was taken and Ernest John returned home to be with his family. This was a difficult time for him, as he suffered badly from nervous depression and really did not want to fight. On arriving in Singapore on the 29th of January 1942, the 4th Battalion was hastily disembarked to defend the northeast of the island. Fighting was fierce, and many were wounded, including Ernest, who was taken to the Alexandra Military Hospital for treatment. Ernest John's niece, Jacqueline, recalled. Unfortunately, soon after landing, he was badly injured. I believe to have been a bullet wound, and he died of his injuries in hospital on the 15th of February, leaving his family devastated, something his mother never got over.
Sadly, it's probably not the case that he died of his wounds that he'd received earlier on. And I'd just like to set the scene about the Alexandra Military Hospital for a moment. It had a normal capacity of about 550 patients, but the battle for Singapore had swelled the numbers to about 900. The men of the 32nd Company of the Royal Army Medical Corps were running the hospital under really difficult circumstances. Water was rationed, torches and lights were used only for medical procedures. But it was nevertheless supposed to be a sanctuary amidst the violence and the turmoil of war. Within its walls, the sick and wounded should have been able to escape the chaos of the battlefield, to receive treatment, care and rest. And like all military hospitals, like all hospitals, it should have been protected by the Red Cross, which is that international symbol that we all know. It represents medical sanctuary. But on the 14th and 15th of February 1942, this hospital was violated by the most awful massacre. And it started about 1 p.m. on the 14th of February, when some soldiers from an Indian regiment fired at some Japanese and then retreated. And the Japanese soldiers entered the hospital and systematically bayoneted staff and patients. And among the casualties was a British officer who was carrying a white flag to signify the hospital's surrender. There were about 50 men killed at this time, and that included 2 patients who were lying on operating tables on the ground floor of the surgical block, as well as doctors and other patients. There were no women because the women nurses had all been evacuated from Singapore at the end of January, so it was all men. And at about 3:30, 200 men, patients and medical staff were rounded up. They were tied into groups of 8 and forced to march to a row of sheds where they were kept overnight. The gravely injured were killed if they fell along the way. There was no ventilation, no water, and they had neither space to sit nor lie down in these sheds. And you can imagine that under these terrible conditions, several men died overnight. The following morning, the survivors were told that they would receive water, and the Japanese troops systematically took them out in pairs and bayoneted them before they pushed them into a mass grave. Affidavits, I'm sorry, I have to just see my affidavits claim that there were about 250 men that died on those 2 days. And Ernest John's death's recorded as being the 15th of February, and he's actually commemorated on the Singapore Civil Hospital Grave Memorial, and that was established for those who died in the Alexandra Hospital massacre on the 15th of February. So knowing now what we do, it's probably better that his family thought he'd died of his wounds. And if you turn to page 5 in your booklet, you'll see a photograph there of the Alexandra Hospital, and a cross on the bottom right which stands in the grounds over the grave of these 250 men that were buried there. They've never been exhumed. They still lie there, and their names, all of their names, are recorded on a memorial at Singapore. I don't know, it's of little comfort to know that the junior Japanese officer who ordered the massacre was executed when more senior Japanese officers arrived. Anyway, so of the 7 men who served with the 4th Suffolks, there were now only 5 left alive, one of whom was your Uncle Les. So we're going to go back now to the 2nd Cambridgeshires, and we're going to find out a little bit more about Ernie Brett, Eric Fake, and a couple of other quite important people with the 2nd Cambridgeshires. So if you look at page 10, you can see a photograph at the bottom there of Ernie Brett, 2nd Cambridgeshire Regiment. When we interviewed him 5 years ago, when he was 97 on the left, and then as a young soldier. Yeah. We'll come to some of the others a little bit later. Okay. So, Ernie with 6 others from Haverhill, who were 2nd Cambridgeshires, that's including Eric Fake, were immediately sent up country to Batu Hat, which is sort of just a little bit further south of that star. And they were tasked with the job of holding a crossroads. On the back of your booklet, I don't know. On the back of your booklet you can see a map, and you can see exactly where Batu Hat is. So here's Singapore Island, and this is where the 2nd Cambridgeshires went to. And they were tasked with this job of holding a crossroads at Sengarin, which is just south of Batu Hat. So there was an important crossroads there that they were tasked with defending. Whilst they were there, Ernie remembered an officer, 2nd Lieutenant Basil Groom, telling him to grab a revolver and hop on the back of his motorbike. They were going to do a recce to see if the road was clear so that they could take the transport back to Singapore. They were retreating from Batu Batam. And Ernie remembered being really quite worried because this motorbike was quite noisy, and he was 22, and I think the lieutenant with him was 23. It's no age at all, is it, to be doing something as important. Anyway, they managed to come back, and the battalion had to withdraw from the town and head for Singapore. But when they reached Sengaren on the 26th of January, they reached the point of no return. Fighting was fierce, and several men were killed, including Second Lieutenant Basil Groom, who had been driving this motorbike when Ernie was on the back. There were several men, who were about 40 actually, who had been quite badly wounded. They were far from being able to walk. One of those men was Eric Fake, who's Rita's brother, and they had no transport, so they had to make the really difficult decision that they couldn't get these 40 wounded men back to Singapore. They had to leave them, and they had to leave them there knowing that the Japanese had never ever taken any prisoners who were wounded alive. They'd just never done that. There were 13 brave men. One of them was a padre, a chaplain called Noel Duckworth. So there was Noel Duckworth, there were 2 doctors, I can't add up, 2 doctors from the field ambulance, and 11 orderlies, so 14 in total, who volunteered to stay with these 40 men who were badly wounded. And they volunteered knowing that they probably wouldn't survive. Now, Padre Duckworth, it's worth finding out a little bit more about him because he was quite an incredible man. He came from up north, but he'd studied at Cambridge, and whilst he was at Cambridge University, he was a cox for their eights, and in I think it was about 1934 to 1936, 3 consecutive years he was the cox in the boat race, and they won a record for being the fastest crew. He was also a member of the 8 that went out to the Olympics in Berlin in 1936, and for all his height of being 5'2", he had quite a feisty character. So when he was when he volunteered to stay behind, and the Japanese did come in and captured them, the 40 wounded and then the 14 men who decided to stay with them, Padre Duckworth sort of jumped up and shouted and ranted and raved, and without a doubt he gave them what for, and because of him it's likely that the Japanese did not kill them. In the 1950s he was one of Eamon Andrews' clients, if you like, on This Is Your Life. And one of the doctors who was with him, who volunteered to stay behind, actually said that the reason they weren't killed was because of Padre Duckworth. And not only was he able to stand his ground against the Japanese, this doctor was convinced that it was because the senior Japanese officer recognised him as a rower. And it seems quite feasible that that's the case, because in both Berlin and in this country, a team from Tokyo University had rowed against the 8 from Cambridge. So we wonder whether it was that reason that he was able to convince them not to kill the prisoners. They were all taken to a jail somewhere about here, before being moved later to Changi. And Padre Duckworth was actually sent up into Thailand and Burma on the railway, whereas your brother never made it to the railway because he was so badly wounded. Yeah. There's a lovely story about Padre Duckworth, because you can imagine the men, one of the pleasures was actually being able to have a cigarette. But without tobacco they used to smoke anything, anything they could pick up, herbs or grass or whatever. But they needed something to roll the cigarettes in. And he had a supply of Bibles. You know what I'm going to say. They said the pages from the Bibles make excellent rolling paper. And he said, that's fine. You can use them as long as you read every word on the page before you smoke them. So he obviously had a tremendous character, and whilst he was a prisoner, he did a lot of work to look after the prisoners. There's a wonderful cartoon of him, if you Google his name you'll see it, of him actually trying to barter with a Japanese guard. He's getting rid of a Parker pen for some food. So yeah, anyway, if we look at page 7, you will see a picture of Rita's brother, Eric. And you'll see a picture of the Padre there as well. So Padre Duckworth on the right, Eric on the left, and Eric was one of these 40 men who was very badly wounded, so badly wounded that he couldn't be sent anywhere. He stayed in Changi for the whole of his time as a prisoner of war, didn't he, Rita? Yeah. He'd been shot in in his left side and also damaged his elbow. So, obviously very serious wounds that he'd sustained. Prior to joining up, he'd worked at Chauncey Mills, hadn't he?
Yeah.
And I think it was that helped him while he was out there, because he repaired Japanese uniforms for them in Changi jail. So he obviously set up a little tailor's outfit there. And also, while he was there, he made a miniature tropical dress uniform. And that made it all the way back to England. And you can see there's some pictures of a cabinet in Duxford, in the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. And the top picture with the medals shows the little uniform that Eric made while he was a prisoner, shows his medals. And if you look at the bigger one that's got the photograph with the drums in, you can just see underneath the drum on the right hand side that small cabinet with the miniature uniforming that was made by Eric. And that's still in Imperial War Museum. I think, am I right in saying that his wife donated it to the museum after his death?
What, the little suit?
Yes.
Yes, that's at Duxford War Museum.
Yeah.
We did that.
Yeah.
Well, we did, didn't we?
Well, we did, yeah.
Jones
You
did.
gave
We
it.
did.
So that,
we got
but,
it.
but
Yeah.
that's what he said.
Yeah.
He said, as long as I'll keep it.
Yes.
He said, but if anything happened to him, he said, I'd want it to go in a museum. He told Wendy that, didn't he, your sister?
Yeah.
And that's
That's
is
what
in,
happened.
yeah.
What happened?
And it's sort of pride of place in their cabinet, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's super. Chilly. Starting to rain? No, it's not supposed to rain. Anyway, when he came back, he worked in Chauncey Mills. He got his job back at Chauncey Mills, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Okay, we'll quickly go on to the fall of Singapore. After the violent week-long battle for Singapore, which saw fierce fighting around the airfield, golf club, Bradall Road and Adam Park areas, and with dwindling supplies, General Percival made a decision to surrender on the 15th of February 1942. All those surviving the action of the previous week were ordered to lay down their arms at 8:30 p.m. That night they slept out in the open, wondering what the future had in store. What followed was 3.5 years as a Japanese prisoner of war. Forced first to live in cramped confines of the island prison, Changi, and later in the work camps that were established in the colonial estates like Adam Parks. The POWs worked in the dockyard and repaired and then rebuilt the airfield on the island. They also erected a Shinto shrine on the shores of McRitchie Reservoir. If you look at page 8, there's a map that shows the camps on Singapore Island, and on page 9 you can see the Shinto temple and a photo of the surrender. The move into Thailand followed, with thousands of Allied POWs being transported to work on the Thai-Burma Railway, and from then until the liberation in August 1945, the battalions moved further and further up into Burma as the railway progressed. They worked night and day blasting rock, building embankments, viaducts and bridges. Worked hard and beaten harder, they had meagre rations and terrible living conditions. They lived with beriberi, cholera, dysentery, malaria, tropical ulcers and other medical conditions. In his interview, Ernie Brett talked about the ulcers he suffered on his legs. On the 24th of June 1942, Ernie was transported overland in the June Mainland Party in the 4th train from Singapore to Thailand. This group of prisoners were tasked with building the huts for the prisoners who followed to build the railway. As the railway progressed, the mainland party moved ahead, preparing the next camps. Usually wearing nothing more than a torn pair of shorts or a modest loincloth, the legs of the prisoners were bare and unprotected against the hard thorns of new bamboo shoots which caused appalling wounds to the legs. Lacking the necessary vitamins and protein to help combat diseases and jungle sores, these soon became infected, and the wounds soon turned into tropical ulcers. There was no medication to treat these ulcers, and Ernie remembered bathing in the River Kwai so that the fish would nibble at the maggots and help cleanse the wound.
Okay, this is the grave of William and Beatrice Buttle, and you'll notice an inscription at the top for their only child, Clifford William Buttle. It says, "In loving memory of our dearly beloved son, Clifford William Buttle, Cambridgeshire Regiment, missing at sea in the Far East, September 1944, aged 28. Cliff, as he was called, was the 5th generation of the Buttle family to live in Haverhill. By the time he was about 12 years old, they'd moved to from Primrose Hill to the Pykel. We have no photograph of Clifford, so if anybody knows this family and can track one down, we'd be very grateful. But on leaving school, he found employment on the clerical staff at Chauntry Mills. But outside of work, he pursued an interest in music. He became the leader of the Cooperative Society Silver Band Prize Band, and was also welcomed to various musical functions as a pianist and organist of considerable promise. At the end of 1939, Cliff, aged 24, joined the 2nd Battalion, Cambridgeshire Regiment. So he served alongside Eric and alongside Ernie, and following the fall of Singapore, he found himself a prisoner of war. Back home, his parents waited anxiously for more news of their son. In January 1944, they received an undated postcard saying that he was interned in No. 2 Camp, Thailand, was in good health and working for pay. Now, the postcards that were sent home were pre-printed, and it was a sort of delete, if not appropriate, sort of job. So you didn't have a chance to put a personal message on or anything like that. It was literally, "I am well, I am being paid, please look after." They had another card in the summer, so that was 2 cards, in January 1944 and then one in the summer. Now, Ernie Brett, who we spoke about earlier, he remembers very well being in the camp with Cliff and some others from Haverhill. It was at the time he was suffering with his ulcerations on his leg, And he remembers a Japanese officer coming into the camp and asking for volunteers to go to work in the mines in Japan. And thinking that it could be no worse than where they were, several of them were keen. One of them was Ernie. But because of his leg ulcers, he was told by the British medical officer that he couldn't go. And so he didn't go, but Cliff and some others went back to Singapore. They were taken back to Singapore, held in the River Valley camp in Singapore while they waited for transportation to Japan. On the 4th of July 1944, 1,287 men were put aboard the cargo ship Hafuku Maru, and it was part of a convoy of 10 ships, 5 of which were carrying a total of some 5,000 prisoners. That was the largest group of POWs ever shipped at any one time during the war. The convoy left Singapore making for Borneo, where the Hafuku Maru dropped out to wait for another convoy that was bound for the Philippines. The POWs were suffering terrible conditions on board. There was heat, disease, hunger, dehydration, and whilst they were in Manila, several of the weakest were removed and replaced by some others, so-called fit prisoners of war. So now the Hafuku Maru has a total of 1,289 prisoners in the holds. On the 20th of September, a convoy of 11 ships, including the Hafuku Maru, which was the only one carrying prisoners, sailed from Manila for Formosa. Ernie told us that the Japanese like to post notices of their successes. For instance, if they'd sunk Allied ships or they'd bombed somewhere and been particularly successful. One day in 1944 he saw a notice about an American attack. The day after the convoy had sailed from Manila, more than 100 aircraft, American aircraft from the USS Hornet, attacked the convoy at 10:30 in the morning. And before the day was finished, all 11 vessels in this convoy, including the Hafuku Maru, which carried no markings to indicate that it was carrying prisoners, they'd all been sunk. Over 1,000 of the POWs perished. Cliff Buttle, Stephen Henry Radford from Haverhill, and we'll see his grave as we walk up here, and a man called John Knott from Hellions Bumpstead. They were all in the 2nd Battalion, Cambridgeshire Regiment, and they were 3 that perished. There were about 249 of the POWs who managed to swim ashore, or they were picked up by the Japanese. And we understand that it's quite possible that 2 more Haverhill men were on this ship and they were picked up. One of them might have been someone called Alfred Newman, but we don't know for sure, and we don't know who the other one would be. But Ernie, going back to Ernie in the camp, he remembers this post going up listing the names of the people who perished. And of course he got down to Clifford Buttle, his friend Cliff, and was shocked by seeing his name there, but possibly quite relieved that he had actually got his leg ulcers that had saved him from being one of those on there. So the 3 men are commemorated because they have no known graves, they sank with the ship. They're commemorated on the Singapore Memorial in Kranji War Cemetery. So of the 7 local men who landed in Singapore with the 2nd Cambridgers, we've now just got 4 left alive. Eric was one of them, and Ernie another.
This is the grave of Harry Ambrose Ashard and his wife Edith Lilly. They ran Ashard's Confectioners and Tobacconists at 23 Queen Street for the best part of 50 years until the 1960s. You will notice on their gravestone is an inscription for their only son, Harry Peter Ashard, who was corporal with the 4th Ordnance Store Group, RAOC. And on page 11 of your booklets is a photograph of Peter, which he sent to his younger sister, Pamela Margaret. After finishing at Haverhill Secondary School, he worked at Shire Hall, Bury St Edmunds, where he followed up his natural bent for mathematics by joining the accounts department. Later he was employed in the Treasury Department of the Wanstead and Woodford Borough Council. And in 1939, Harry passed the intermediate examination of the Institute of Municipal Treasurers and Accountants. This was a national examination and he was awarded the bronze medal for coming third overall. In 1940, Harry joined the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, quickly making the rank of corporal. And on January the 20th, 1941, he married Hilary Margaret Sanderson from Ilford. And I think you'll find there's a photograph of their wedding day on page 11. The following year, he was caught up for the Battle of Singapore and found himself a prisoner of war like so many others from East Anglia. And following the surrender, his wife and parents received notification that he was missing, believed to be prisoner of war, but this was not confirmed until March 1943, 13 months after he'd been taken prisoner. In July, August and December 1943, postcards were received by his family, but during 1944 no further word was received from him. And then on the 3rd of February 1945, the South West Suffolk Echo reported, "Old Haverhill boy dies in number 4 Thailand camp." Much sympathy is felt for Mr. and Mrs. H.A. Ashard and the family of Queen Street, who during last weekend heard the sad news that their only son, Corporal Harry Peter Ashard of the RAOC, had died. Later it was learnt that Harry had actually died from dysentery on the 20th July 1943, before the postcards he had sent were received at home. Another Haverhill man, Sidney Pavey, also a POW, was in the burial party. Harry Peter Ashard's final resting place is in the Dom Rat War Cemetery in Thailand. And we were quite pleased that last Saturday, which was VJ Day, we had a representative from the RBL in Thailand who placed poppy crosses on all our men from Haverhill on the headstones that were buried in Thailand. So we were very grateful to him for doing that.
So now we're standing beside the grave of Cliff and Florence Freeman, and you'll notice it's not very clear, but because it's worn, but there's an inscription there to their son, Philip Roy Clifford Freeman. And on page 11 you'll find a photo of Phil that was taken in about 1939. He's looking very relaxed in his RAF uniform. Phil was born on the 7th of May 1915. He was the eldest son of Cliff and his wife Florence, who was also called Floss Darking. In 1917, Cliff was badly wounded at Passchendaele and spent much of the next 5 years in hospital and convalescent homes. So it wasn't an easy upbringing for Phil as a child. And at the age of 12, in 1927, he won a scholarship to the grammar school. He became the first grammar school boy in the family. But when his father lost his job in 1931, Phil left school and sat the RAF apprentices exam. He passed with flying colours and began his training at RAF Halton in September 1931. After 3 years at Halton, Phil was posted to RAF Felixstowe, where alongside his work he indulged in his twin passions of photography and cricket. He was a fine off-spin bowler. He once took 4 wickets in 4 balls, and he was nicknamed Titch after his namesake A.P. Titch Freeman, who was a legendary leg spin bowler at the time for Kent and England. Ironically, Phil was rather tall though. We were very fortunate 5 years ago because Phil's nephew and his youngest brother came along and talked to everybody who came about Phil, who was obviously a very special member of their family. In 1938, Phil married a Doreen Dawson in Felixstowe, where he had been posted to. and in May 1939 he was posted with 62 Squadron to the Far East, where he saw service first in Singapore and then Alor Star in northern Malaya, before being sent on a detachment where he worked with 205 Squadron on the Catalina flying boats. Just days before the fall of Singapore, he was one of the RAF men who were relocated to Java. So as the army was arriving, Phil was leaving, going to Java. It didn't stop him being captured, and he was captured on the 8th of March. When he was captured in Java, he was initially brought back to Changi Jail in Singapore, but then moved to northern Borneo, and from April 1943 he was a prisoner at the infamous Sandakan POW camp. This was a camp that had 6,500 Australian and British prisoners. They were sent there to construct a military airfield using not much more than just bare hands. And of those 6,500, there were just 6 who survived. They were 6 Australians who managed to escape. Every single Allied prisoner who remained, that's 6,494 men, died either from disease, malnutrition, or the brutality of their captors. And in the final months of the war, there were several rather notorious 250-kilometre death marches. The men were forced to march long distances, and very many of them didn't survive. Phil died at Sandakan on the 3rd of April 1945, officially from malaria, and he was buried in the camp's number 2 cemetery. His remains were later moved to the war cemetery on Lambuan Island, which is just off the coast of northern Borneo, and that's where he lies now.
Okay, we now go on to VJ Day in 1945. Japan made an offer of surrender on the 10th of August, 4 days after the US Air Force dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 1 day after Nagasaki suffered the same fate. But it took several days for the exact terms of surrender to be agreed. When the news of the initial offer broke, London took to the streets to celebrate. VJ Day stands for Victory over Japan Day. It is the name given to the 15th of August 1945, the day Japan publicly announced its surrender. On September the 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Allied and Japanese forces came together to sign the document of surrender, officially bringing the Second World War to an end. Here are some extracts from the Southwest Suffolk Echo, which tells us about VJ Day on the 15th of August 1945. In the softened light of the great bonfire on the recreation ground on Tuesday evening, August the 14th, with lights appearing from every window and street lamp, one could not help but rejoice at the emergence from darkness after 6 weary years of war. The town was happy and there was no sign of disorder. Church bells were very soon heard ringing, and belated decorators were busy putting out the flags and bunting until at last the town was bedecked to suit the occasion. After a hastily arranged council meeting, Alderman Costa ascended the town hall balcony where a loudspeaker was fixed to declare, "At last has come the news from which we have all been waiting for so long. The Japanese have surrendered unconditionally and the war in the Far East has ended." After the national anthem was played, many townsfolk heard the news with profound relief and joy. The celebration of VE Day was surpassed by the VJ events and celebrations. The following extracts from articles that appeared in the press about the arrival home of some of Haverhill's Far East prisoners of war. They provide an insight into the feelings of the people at the time. Uppermost in the minds of many of our readers will be a sense of thanksgiving that so many of the forgotten men of the Far East are now safely on their way home. The Corfu, which berthed at Southampton, was the first of a long procession of ships returning these soldiers to their native land. At the dock, a great welcome awaited these men of the East Anglian 18th Division who have suffered so much for their country. There were over 1,500 soldiers on the Corfu, and it took approximately 4 hours to get them ashore. Amongst the passengers were Captain W.V. Gertine and Captain L. Tuck, some of whose experiences we were able to record. Much of what was told us was not for publication, but sufficiently appears in print to show the most unbelievable sufferings through which they have passed. Haverhill folk were given a full vent to their feelings on Saturday evening when 4 more men returned from captivity. An enthusiastic crowd gathered at the station to meet the train bearing the precious human cargo, and greetings and embraces were lavished on the travellers without partiality. Ernie Brett, who we heard of earlier, recalls that his mother did not recognise him until he spoke to her. When ex-RAF man Bunny Bowles was 70, he was interviewed and he recalled that the organisation for the return of POWs was very good. He came into Southampton and disembarked straight onto a waiting train that took them to Wolverhampton. Welfare officers handed out telegram forms for them to fill in so that they could let their families know that they were back on British soil. From Wolverhampton he went by bus to Cosford to be processed. Men were given a medical, they were interviewed, paid, issued with clothing and given a train warrant to enable them to get home. But what then?
Today much more is known about post-traumatic stress syndrome than when these men returned, and people are more aware of the issues that affect mental health. In 1945, these men were advised not to talk about their experiences, and their families were told not to ask questions, and consequently they had to deal with this on their own. Bunny Bowers said that his saving grace was taking long walks with the family dog. He used to meet another Far East prisoner of war, Jack Darking, who also had his dog, and they would walk together, ending up at the Servicemen's Club for a game of snooker and a pint. Bunny also spoke about the long-term physical effects that many suffered, bouts of malaria and the treatment he had to endure for parasitic worms, something that many men suffered from. And he remembered that a course of treatment lasted for 5 days and involved 48 hours of starvation, followed by a dose of medicine. They were allowed home for the weekend, and on Monday when they returned they were tested to see if the treatment had been successful. Bunny endured 13 weeks of treatments before he was cleared of the problem. And it's satisfying, I think, to learn that those who returned were treated well by their former employers. Many were employed in Chauntry Mills and found their jobs were waiting for them. Eric was just one of those. And of course Bill Gertine, he would have known and understood only too well because he'd been a prisoner of war for 3.5 years himself. Ernie Brett worked for Mr. Sainsbury's, and he returned to his job looking after a prize herd of Guernseys. And Bunny continued his job in the RAF. He served until he was 55. For others though, settling into the old way of life was very difficult. Fred Baker, for instance, he came back and he found life extremely difficult until he got a job as a milkman, and he thoroughly enjoyed just being outside on his own in fresh air. And your uncle didn't settle too well, did he, until his wife took over a pub?
Yeah,
and
he got that through another prisoner, John
yes,
Clark.
Yes.
John Clark was managing director of Green King, and they've been on the railway together.
Yeah.
And he got a pub through John Clark.
And your cousin said that that his wife was really pleased that they got the pub because she could keep an eye on him.
That's strange because she was Bill Gertine's secretary.
Oh, was she?
Yeah, during the war.
Oh,
yeah.
wow, okay. Now, your uncle Les also made a group of friends that he kept in touch with, and you've mentioned one, VJ Clark. from Bury.
Yeah, we met him.
You've met him. And apparently they used to talk on the phone, and they met to play bridge. That was a game they played as prisoners, and they enjoyed getting together for FIPO dinners. And this sort of bonding between the men was clearly very important, and probably played a huge role in helping them to overcome the horrors they'd seen and endured, because they could share their experiences. Exactly, yeah. Anyway, we've come to the end of our walk and talk experience, and I hope that you found it interesting. We've compiled a list of 69 names, men from Haverhill and the local villages, who found themselves in Singapore in January 1942, and we've begun to gather some information about them. We started off by doing the research on the casualties, the men who didn't come back, but now we've had several family members who have helped us to compile tributes for their fathers, grandfathers or whatever, and we hope that we're going to get more. We also would like very much to try and gather some information about the men from the 14th Division, those men from the Forgotten Army who fought in Burma, because we don't know very much about them and their experiences.
Now I thought we should have pushed him a bit, but I don't think I could have done. He didn't ever speak to my mum about it. It was after he died, we asked her. She never said a word. The only thing she can remember is at the end of the war, or after the war, they went to the cinema, and remember the Pathé News, and it was showing prisoners coming back, and he was in Burma, but not on the railway. He was just fighting in Burma. And she said the Pathé News came on, and about people coming back, and he started to cry. And she said, he had to get up and walk out. That's the only thing he ever showed. But I'm quite absolutely sure he was a very different man when he came back to the man who went in 1941.
I think that we should perhaps try and do some research about the men. I don't know how. I think I've heard from 4 people so far who had relatives who were fighting in Burma as part of the 14th Division. That's quite separate to the 18th Division. The people in the 14th Division were up. They were coming down here trying to push against the Japanese. So your father would have been there.
All I know is that he said that they went to India, and they disembarked in Pune, and that's all he ever said. And that when he came back just before the end of VJ. He got back on VE Day, and he'd been wounded, and he was sent back early.
And you said he arrived back on VE Day.
He arrived back on VE Day because it was a bank holiday. The ships were kept out in Liverpool Bay, so the men couldn't get off the ship and go home. Whenever you mentioned VE Day to me, he said, "Don't you talk to me about bloody VE Day." Another day. And Mum said that when he came home, she was sitting on the stairs, because they didn't do in London then. Sitting on the stairs. He was at the door. Couldn't believe it. His mother was upset because he didn't go round there first.
Perhaps you should write all this down for us.
Yeah? Something,
Yeah, that would be great. Anyway, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For organising.
Lovely to meet you all.
It's been really, really interesting.
We'll send you your Japanese
Lovely.
prisoner of war cards,
Thank
and
you very much.
I'll look for the liberation questionnaire for you.
Thank you.
And you've got yours, haven't you? I sent you yours.
Very good, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
very well.
Very interesting. In January 1942, 69 men from Haverhill and the surrounding villages found themselves in Singapore. 22 did not come home, and those who survived suffered 3.5 years of captivity as Japanese prisoners of war. On this 75th anniversary of victory over Japan, Haverhill remembers them all.
Philip William Allen, 5th Suffolks. Harry Peter Ashard, RAOC, did not return. George Wilfred Backler, 5th Suffolks. My father, Frederick Baker, 5th Suffolks. Leonard Eric Barber, 5th Suffolks. Ernest J. Barrett, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Alan William Basham, Royal Artillery. John Bigmore, 1st Cambridgeshire's, did not return. Bernard Bunny Bowers, RAF. Edward Bradford, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Ernest Brett, 2nd Cambridgeshire's. Clifford William Buttle, 2nd Cambridgeshire's, did not return.
Frederick Chisnall of the 5th Suffolks, he did not return. David Jack Coote of the 5th Suffolks. Charlie Victor Coote of the 1st Cambridgeshire's, he did not return. Arthur Harry Cox of the 1st Cambridgeshire's. Peter Sidney Cresswell of the 5th Suffolks. Walter Crissell of the 5th Suffolks. Leonard George Cuthbert of the 5th Suffolks. Jack Albert Darkin of the 5th Suffolks. My grandfather Ben Farrant of the 2nd Cambridgeshire's. My great-uncle Albert Farrant of the 4th Suffolks. John Farrant of the 5th Suffolks, and Philip R.C. Freeman of the RAF. He did not return.
Albert Edward Green, 4th Suffolks. My father, William Bill Gertine, 1st Cambridgeshire's. Alfred John Harding, 5th Suffolks. Norman Harrison, 5th Suffolks.
William V. Isaacs, Royal Corps of Signals. Reginald George Jeffrey, 2nd Cambridgeshire's, did not return. Ernest Dick Jobson, 5th Suffolks. John Edward Nope, 2nd Cambridgeshire's, did not return.
Leslie Warner Ling, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Roy Percy Loveday, 5th Suffolks. Ronald Marsh, 5th Suffolks. Cyril Douglas, Chick Mays, 5th Suffolks.
Harry Mays, 5th Suffolks. Harold Mays, Military Police. Ernest Mays, 5th Suffolks. Thomas Mays, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Charles Medcalf, 5th Suffolks. Ronald Frederick Medcalf, 5th Suffolks. Stanley Frederick Pony Moore, 1st Cambridgeshire's. Robert James Moy, 5th Suffolks. Henry Minot, 4th Suffolks, did not return. Alfred Newman, 5th Suffolks. Eric David Nunn, 1st Cambridgeshire's.
My uncle, Archie Pannell, 5th Suffolks. Sidney William Pavey, Royal Corps of Signals. Charles Frederick Press, 5th Suffolks. Cleveland Arthur Preston, 5th Suffolks. Stephen Henry Radford, 2nd Cambridgeshire's, did not return. Dennis Ray, 1st Cambridgeshire's. Bertie Sadler, 4th Suffolks, did not return. Percy Herbert Shearman, 5th Suffolks. Frederick John Smith, 5th Suffolks. Leslie James Tarling, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Reginald Taylor, 4th Suffolks.
Ronald Taylor, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Eric Archibald Thake, 2nd Cambridgeshires. Clifford William Thake, 5th Suffolks. My uncle Leslie Tuck, 4th Suffolks. Cyril Albert Turner, 5th Suffolks. Peter Walter Turner, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Cyril Harry Walters, 5th Suffolks, did not return. George Thomas Webb, 5th Royal Norfolks, did not return. James Harold Wesley, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Reginald Wesley, 5th Suffolks, did not return. Frederick Willett, 5th Suffolks,